there is a place in the swampy lowlands of northeastern Louisiana, 15 miles from the current course of the Mississippi River, where the ground rises in a pattern that should not exist. 6 enormous ridges of earth curved into concentric half-circles, each one carefully shaped and deliberately placed, stretching across a landscape that the people who built them had no reason, by any accepted understanding of how human societies work, to be capable of reshaping in this way. The outermost ridge runs 3/4 of a mile from end to end. The entire complex covers 402 acres. At its western edge, rising 72 feet above the Louisiana floodplain, stands a mound so large that a modern 10-wheel dump truck would need more than 30,000 loads to move the soil it contains. The people who built it lived between 1700 and 1100 BC. When they were building it, Stonehenge had already been standing for 500 years. Queen Nefertiti was still a living memory in Egypt. The Bronze Age was at its height across the Mediterranean, and in the bayous of Louisiana, a population that archaeologists classify as hunter-gatherers. People who did not farm, did not have domesticated animals, did not have metal tools, did not have wheels or carts, or any of the technological infrastructure that every other civilization in the ancient world used to build monuments of this scale, were moving 140,000 dump truck loads of earth into precise geometric forms that have stood for 3,400 years without significant erosion. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows how a population that was supposed to be constantly moving in small groups, following game and seasonal food sources, organized itself to do this. Nobody knows where the people who built it went when they abandoned it around 700 BC, leaving it empty and silent for 1,500 years. And the ground at the center of the site, the central plaza, the interior of the mounds, the sections that have not been excavated, has not been fully opened. What lies beneath the surface of Poverty Point, the largest and most complex late archaic earthwork site in North America, remains partially unknown. This is the site that archaeologists have chosen, deliberately and systematically, not to fully excavate. And the more that has been learned about it from the outside, the more the decision not to open it completely appears to be protecting a question that the field of archaeology does not yet have the tools to answer. The site is called Poverty Point. The name comes from a 19th century plantation that occupied the land before the earthworks were formally identified as prehistoric. It is a name that has nothing to do with the people who built it, who left no written records, no known name for themselves, and no account of their purposes. What they left is the earthworks, and the earthworks, the longer researchers have studied them, have produced a series of findings that collectively constitute one of the most uncomfortable bodies of evidence in the archaeology of the ancient Americas. The first thing that makes Poverty Point uncomfortable is the scale. The 6 concentric ridges are not simple piles of earth. They are engineered features, carefully shaped, deliberately layered, constructed with an attention to geometry that is visible from the air, but difficult to fully appreciate at ground level. The outermost ridge is the largest. Each successive ring moves inward, smaller and closer to the central plaza, in a pattern that implies advanced planning of the entire complex, before the first basket of earth was moved. The total volume of earth moved to create the ridges and mounds has been estimated at approximately 53 million cubic feet. The laborers who moved it carried it in basket, loads of roughly 50 pounds each. The calculations that produce the 53 million cubic foot figure require approximately 2 million basket loads of earth to be transported, shaped, and placed with sufficient precision to produce the geometric forms that are still visible today. 2 million basket loads, carried by people who had no wheels. The largest single mound, Mound A, the 72-foot structure at the western edge of the complex, contains an estimated 8.4 million cubic feet of earth on its own. It would be the largest earthen mound in the United States if the Monk's Mound at Cahokia were not larger, and Cahokia was built over 1,000 years later by a population that had agriculture, permanent settlements, and a complex social hierarchy. Poverty Point was built by hunter-gatherers. That is the central problem that the site has posed to archaeologists since radiocarbon dating first established its age in the 1950s. The academic understanding of what hunter-gatherers can and cannot do does not accommodate poverty point. Hunter-gatherers, in the standard model of human social development, live in small mobile groups. They follow food sources. They do not build permanent structures. They do not engage in large-scale organized labor. They do not produce monumental architecture. Every one of those generalizations is contradicted by the physical evidence at poverty point. The second thing that makes poverty point uncomfortable is not the scale of what was built, but the speed. In 2013, a team of researchers led by anthropologist Tristram Kidder of Washington University in St. Louis published the results of geo-archaeological analysis of Mound A. They extracted soil cores from multiple locations within the mound and examined them at both the macro and micro level, looking at the visible stratigraphy of soil layers and at the microscopic composition of the soil at the boundaries between layers. What they found was this: there were no erosion events in the mound, no evidence of rainfall interrupting the construction, no natural soil formation between construction phases, no cultural stages suggesting the work paused and resumed. The mound showed continuous, uninterrupted construction from base to summit. Their conclusion was that Mound A, the largest mound at the site, containing 8.4 million cubic feet of earth, was built in a single continuous effort lasting fewer than 90 days, 90 days, to move 8.4 million cubic feet of earth using basket brigades of human workers carrying 50 pounds at a time. With no draft animals, no wheels, no metal tools, the mathematics of that construction rate require thousands of workers operating simultaneously in a coordinated system. Kidder described what he called a bucket brigade approach, workers passing soil from hand to hand along a human chain, maintaining continuous movement of material from source to destination without pause. The organization required to sustain that operation for 90 days, to feed thousands of workers, to coordinate the movement of soil from multiple sources, to maintain the geometric precision of the construction, while working at that pace, implies a level of social coordination that the standard model of hunter-gatherer society does not predict. And here is the detail that makes it stranger still. There is no evidence that Poverty Point was a permanent settlement. The people who built it appear to have arrived, built, gathered, and left. The food remains found at the site. Nuts, persimmons, fish bones, deer bones are consistent with seasonal occupation rather than year-round residence. The residential evidence suggests temporary habitation rather than a permanent community. People who were passing through, who came together periodically at this location and then dispersed back into the wider landscape, built the largest earthwork complex in North America in a series of rapid construction events, and then they stopped coming. Around 700 BC, the site was abandoned. The ridges fell silent, the mound stood empty. 1,500 years passed before another group of people briefly reoccupied a small section of the site around 700 AD, and then left again. The people who built Poverty Point vanished from the archaeological record. Their descendants, if they have living descendants, are not known. The reason they left is not known. The reason they came in the first place is not known. The third thing that makes Poverty Point uncomfortable is the trade network that supported it. The site was not self-sufficient in raw materials. The people who gathered at Poverty Point brought things with them from extraordinary distances. Projectile points and stone tools found at the site were made from materials originating in the Ouachita and Ozark Mountains, hundreds of miles to the northwest. Soapstone vessels came from the Appalachian foothills of northern Alabama and Georgia, over 500 miles to the northeast. Quartz crystal came from Arkansas, steatite from the Atlanta area, copper ornaments from the Great Lakes region, over 1,000 miles to the north. One estimate places the total geographic reach of the Poverty Point trade network at over 1,500 miles. 1,500 miles of active material exchange, sustained across the period of the site's occupation, flowing into a location in the Louisiana bayous, where hunter-gatherers were building earthworks that required 90-day construction sprints involving thousands of coordinated workers. The material evidence of this trade network is not ambiguous. The stone tools are at the site. The soapstone is at the site. The copper is at the site. These objects traveled from their geological sources to northeastern Louisiana by routes that are not documented, carried by people whose names and languages are not known, in quantities sufficient to supply a construction project of continental significance. The Hopewell interaction sphere, the great trade network of 200 BC to 500 AD that we examined in a previous investigation on this channel, was once considered the earliest example of continent-spanning exchange in North America. Poverty Point predates it by over 1,000 years, and the scale of material movement it implies is comparable. Something was happening at Poverty Point that drew people and materials from across the eastern United States, something important enough to justify the construction of the largest earthwork complex on the continent. Something significant enough to sustain that construction over several centuries before the site was abruptly abandoned. That something has not been identified. Before we continue, if investigations like this one, following physical evidence into the parts of American history that the standard account leaves unexplained, open something for you, consider subscribing. This channel exists to take these questions seriously. Subscribing allows that work to continue. In 2025, Kidder and his team published a reinterpretation of what Poverty Point was for. The dominant theory for decades had been that the site represented a complex chiefdom, a hierarchically organized society with powerful leaders who could command labor on a large scale. The monumental architecture seemed to require that kind of top-down organization. The conventional wisdom of archaeology held that you couldn't build Mound A in 90 days without a chief who could force people to do it. Kidder's new research challenges that assumption directly. The evidence, he and his colleagues argue, points not to a chiefdom but to a gathering place, a location where egalitarian hunter-gatherer groups from across the southeastern and midwestern United States came together periodically, perhaps annually, perhaps on longer cycles, to trade, to socialize, to perform shared rituals, and to build. The construction, in this interpretation, was not imposed by a hierarchy. It emerged from a shared sense of collective obligation. People came to Poverty Point because coming to Poverty Point meant something, because the act of building, of adding your labor to the growing structure, was itself part of the ritual significance of the gathering. This interpretation explains several things that the chiefdom model struggles with. It explains why the site shows periodic rapid construction rather than continuous gradual accumulation. The bursts of construction correspond to gatherings. Between gatherings, the site sat quiet. It explains why the food remains suggest temporary occupation rather than permanent habitation. The people came, built, exchanged, performed their ceremonies, and left. And it explains in a limited way why the site was eventually abandoned. If what held the gathering together was a shared set of ritual obligations and a common sense of purpose, rather than the coercive power of a chief, then the dissolution of that shared purpose could end the gathering without dramatic catastrophe. People stopped coming. The site fell silent. What it does not explain is why people from 1,500 miles away felt that shared sense of purpose, what the ritual obligations were, what was believed to happen at Poverty Point that made moving 8.4 million cubic feet of earth in 90 days worth doing. The interior of Poverty Point has not been fully excavated. This is stated plainly in the site's management documentation and in the academic literature. The UNESCO designation that the site received in 2014, World Heritage Site status, was granted specifically because of what the site's documentation described as rich and largely undisturbed buried deposits. Largely undisturbed, after 3,400 years, the decision not to fully excavate is not, in this case, driven solely by NAGPRA obligations or by legal protection of Native American remains, though both of those considerations are present. The site is protected as a national monument, a national historic landmark, a state historic site, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a layered set of protections that restricts what can be done within its boundaries. But the deeper reason that archaeologists have chosen not to attempt a comprehensive excavation of Poverty Point is more fundamental than legal restriction. It is that the questions the site raises are not questions that excavation, with currently available methods, could definitively answer. Excavating a burial mound destroys the context that makes it readable. The stratigraphy, the precise layering of soil, artifact, and organic material that encodes the history of the structure, exists only as long as the structure is intact. Once a section is dug, That section's information is either retrieved or lost forever, depending on the rigor of the excavation and the sophistication of the methods applied. The methods available in the 1970s were not the methods available in 2025. LiDAR mapping, aerial laser scanning that can reveal buried features without any physical excavation, has already shown that Poverty Point contains features not visible from the surface. Ground-penetrating radar can trace buried structures without removing a gram of soil. Environmental DNA analysis can recover biological information from soil samples taken with minimal disturbance. These methods are being applied. The picture they are producing is more complex than what surface observation alone reveals. What they have not yet revealed is why. The geometry of the ridges, the speed of the construction, the scale of the trade network, the ritual purpose that brought thousands of people from across the continent to a bayou in Louisiana for centuries, and then stopped bringing them and then never brought them again. The site sits in northeastern Louisiana today, protected and mostly quiet. The grass-covered ridges are visible from the observation tower at the visitor center. Mound A rises at the western edge of the complex, 72 feet of compacted earth that has held together for 3,400 years, longer, as one researcher noted, than most modern bridges, highways and dams. The people who built it left no name for themselves. They left no written record of their purposes. They left the earthworks and the stone tools from 500 miles away, and the copper from the Great Lakes, and the fired clay cooking balls by the thousands, a distinctive technology found at Poverty Point sites and almost nowhere else, and the question of who organized all of it and why. 3.5 millennia of Louisiana weather have not erased the ridges. Agricultural development destroyed some of the peripheral features before the site was protected, but the core complex stands. The mounds are intact. What they contain, below the surface, in the soil that has not been opened, is what the field of archaeology is waiting for the right methods to ask. The question is not whether archaeologists refuse to open the site. They are working on it carefully with tools that do not require physical excavation. The question is what they will find when those tools become precise enough to see what is there. Something built Poverty Point. Something drew thousands of people from 1,500 miles away to build it in 90-day construction sprints. Something ended it, cleanly and completely, around 700 BC. The ridges remember it. The mounds contain it, and the ground has been keeping its silence for 3,400 years, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right way. That question has not yet been asked. If this investigation opens something for you, share it with one person who needs to see it, and before you go, do you think Poverty Point was a religious gathering place, a trade center, or something else entirely that we haven't considered yet? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone.